title screen, National Park Service Arrowhead logo, Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. Stories of Hope in Slavery and Freedom with David, Museum Technician.
Hello, my name is David Wooldridge. I'm the museum technician here at Appomattox Courthouse. And I'm standing here in front of the Kelly Robinson home today because I'd like to talk to you about John Robinson and his family and tell you about some of the other amazing stories of African Americans that lived here at Appomattox Courthouse and in Appomattox County before, during, and after the surrender events of April of 1865.
Banjo Players of Appomattox Courthouse.
The first group of people I'd like to tell you about are ones whose names we don't even know. These were enslaved Africans who lived here close by at Appomattox Courthouse that played the banjo. There was a young white boy by the name of Joel Sweeney who at a very early age studied and learned from these enslaved musicians the music of the banjo. And although these African musicians who played the banjo never left the confines of the homes where they were enslaved, their music and their musical instrument was spread far and wide throughout North America and the British Isles by this young Joel Sweeney. And there was a banjo craze that could be directly tied back to these enslaved African American musicians who lived near the banks of the Appomattox River.
Molly Stevens.
Another story I'd like to tell you about is about Molly Stevens. Molly Stevens, when just a little girl, 13 or 14 years old, was an enslaved nursemaid at the Pierce family. She cared for Jenny and George Pierce's young child, and she was caring for that child when the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse took place. And her account of how she witnessed those events is one of the few primary sources of African Americans, enslaved African Americans at Appomattox Courthouse here, and how they experienced the events of the surrender of April 9th, 1865.
Hannah Reynolds.
One of the most famous stories of Appomattox Courthouse involves Hannah Reynolds. Hannah Reynolds was an enslaved woman who became the one and only civilian casualty of the battle that took place here preceding the surrender. For a long time we thought Hannah had died from an artillery shell that wounded her on April 9th. But a local historian and researcher has recently found out that Hannah actually was taken into one of the Union field hospitals near the site where she was wounded, and she malingered there. She lived on for 3 days, long enough on her death certificate for her to be identified as a free woman.
A family home.
Again, the house that you see behind me is the Kelly Robinson house, so called because immediately after the war, John Robinson moved in. John Robinson had been an enslaved man somewhere nearby, and he bought this house in 1866, moved his family in here, and by 1871 had paid off this home. His daughters later in an interview revealed that 18 children and grandchildren had grown up in this house at one point in time or another. Not only that, John ran his shop, his cobbler shop, from the basement here at his home until 1925 when he moved it into the modern day town of Appomattox. John lived here until 1933, and he and some of the members of his family are buried in a small cemetery in the back of the house here. He also was one of the founding members of the first African American church in Appomattox County, Galilee Baptist Church, which today still stands and has an active congregation, and you can find it out on Highway 24 just to the west of the national park.
Establishing a national park.
The last story I'd like to tell you about today is about Company 1351, Camp 28 of the Civilian Conservation Corps that was here at Appomattox Courthouse upon establishment of the park. This unit was part of a force of men who were put to work through the Great Depression through the Works Progress Administration, working on large infrastructure projects. This unit was particularly special because it was made up of black veterans from the First World War, including the Harlem Hellcats that were famous for their service during the war. About 190 of these men came to Appomattox Courthouse here. And in this village that was built largely with labor from enslaved people 100+ years before, they went to work clearing the roads, clearing the fields, tearing down old dilapidated fence lines, clearing the site of the McLean House where the surrender took place. These men even hoisted the first flag here at the national park. Most people know of Appomattox because of the story of the surrender that took place here in 1865. But there are also over 4,600 other stories of the African Americans, both enslaved and free, that lived here and made this a living, vibrant community before, during, and after the events of spring of 1865.